On July 19, 1943, the night air was thick, hanging heavy with tension. Beneath the inky black sky of the Solomon Sea, we were as still as shadows, drifting silently in the water. The only sound was the gentle lap of waves against the hull and the rhythmic hum of our engines, now cut to idle. The Japanese destroyer's searchlight swept across the water, cutting through the darkness like a razor. We held our breath, every second stretching into eternity. It passed us just inches away, and we exhaled, but we knew it was only a matter of time before that deadly beam found us. Hidden behind the towering, jagged peaks of Villa La Vella, our boats waited in the cloak of darkness. PT-164 was barely more than a whisper in the night. Behind us, PT-168 and PT-171 were also waiting, poised to strike. The three of us, small wooden boats against the might of the Imperial Japanese Navy, had a single, simple mission: to sink their transports, disrupt their reinforcements, and turn the tide of this war. In the next few minutes, we'd become part of a battle that could change the Pacific forever. My hands were tight on the twin 0.5 caliber mounts, knuckles white. The weight of the moment was heavy. Each breath felt like the last, each second like a countdown. Beside me, Ensign Robert Dutch Vanderberg muttered coordinates under his breath, his eyes scanning the dark horizon. "We're ready, Skipper," he whispered to Lieutenant Commander Arthur Mac McPhersonson, who was at the helm, his gaze fixed forward, watching the water for signs of the enemy. "Patience," Mac said. His voice was calm, steady, though we all knew what was at stake. The Japanese destroyer wasn't our only threat. Behind it were nearly 8,000 enemy soldiers, packed into transports, unknowingly heading toward a trap. If we failed, those soldiers would reinforce Kolombangara, where they'd wipe out our forces in a matter of hours. Tonight, we weren't just fighting for our survival. We were fighting to change the course of the war. At that moment, we were America's secret weapon, small, fast, and deadly. The Japanese didn't know it yet, but the darkness was no longer their ally. We were about to show them why. My name is Thomas "Tom" Harrigan, Chief Petty Officer in the United States Navy Reserve. I was part of the crew of PT-164, one of the first to prove that small wooden boats could sink massive steel warships. People often ask me what it was like to be part of that secret mission, the mission that would forever change the way naval warfare was fought. The truth is, we didn't think about history. We didn't think about making headlines. We only thought about staying alive and doing our job. In exactly 4 minutes, we would unleash hell on the Japanese. But it wasn't just about sinking ships. Every torpedo we carried was a lifeline for American boys fighting on the front lines. Every ship we sank meant one less telegram delivered back home to parents who feared the worst. We were about to change the fate of thousands, and maybe even save our own lives in the process. To understand what we were up against, you need to know what the Japanese Navy was like in 1943. They had perfected the art of night fighting, turning the cover of darkness into a weapon. Since their victory at Savo Island the year before, they controlled the night. Our ships, larger and more powerful, were helpless against their swift, stealthy tactics. The Japanese had no radar, no advanced technology, but they had something far more dangerous: years of training, a mastery of the night, and a fearsome resolve. They called it the Tokyo Express, fast, stealthy supply runs under the cover of darkness. To us, it was the Rat Run. Every night, they moved supplies and soldiers from one base to the next, confident that they were untouchable. But they hadn't reckoned on one thing: us. We weren't big, we weren't powerful. We didn't have radar, we didn't have the guns of a destroyer or the firepower of a battleship. But we had something better: speed, surprise, and a will to fight. We were the PT boats, small, sleek, and built for this exact moment. We were the answer to the Japanese dominance in the darkness, the key to breaking their stranglehold on the Solomon Islands. Mac had drilled into us that our PT boats weren't designed for traditional battles. We weren't here to slug it out in gun duels or to play by the enemy's rules. We were maritime guerrillas, hit-and-run fighters who struck like shadows in the night, and we were about to show the Japanese what it meant to underestimate us. "Stay sharp," Mac said. "If we do this right, we'll be ghosts. We attack fast, hit hard, and vanish before they know what hit them. They won't know we were even here." We were ready. We had to be. This wasn't just another mission. This was the chance to prove that American ingenuity could overcome any obstacle, that a handful of small, determined boats could change the course of a war. The torpedoes were loaded. The engines were tuned to perfection. We were as prepared as we'd ever be. Now, all we had to do was wait for the signal. As the Japanese convoy slowly made its way into range, we could feel the weight of the mission pressing down on us. The time was near. This was the moment we trained for, the moment we would either sink or swim. We were about to show the world what these tiny wooden boats could do. "Here we go," Mac said, his voice low but full of purpose. "When I give the word, we attack, and we don't stop until they're all at the bottom of the sea." We nodded, knowing there was no turning back. Tonight, we would make history. July 1943. The Pacific was a vast and unforgiving expanse. The waters were as treacherous as the battles fought on them, each wave hiding 1,000 dangers and each night a deadly promise. We weren't just fighting the enemy, we were fighting the very environment that had shaped the war. The Solomons were no place for traditional tactics. The Japanese had learned how to own the night. They had made it their domain, their secret weapon. When they attacked at Savo Island in August 1942, they proved it. In one catastrophic battle, they sank 4 Allied cruisers without losing a single ship. They had turned darkness into an ally, slipping through the night like shadows, unseen and deadly. It was a perfect ambush, a masterstroke of war. They dominated the darkness while we struggled to hold our ground. At that moment, it became clear we needed something that could counter this, and we needed it fast. Our Navy had more ships, more firepower, and better radar, but that didn't matter. We were losing the battle for the night. Our heavy cruisers and destroyers were built for large-scale confrontations, for wide-open seas. They were not suited for the narrow, choked waters of the Solomons. The island chain was a deadly maze of reefs, hidden strongholds, and towering volcanic islands that the Japanese knew how to navigate with ease. We needed a new approach, something small, something fast, something that could slip through the enemy's defenses like a knife through butter. But how? The answer came not from the admirals or the generals, but from the shipyards of America, from a place where necessity and sheer American ingenuity came together to create something that would change naval warfare forever. The PT boat was born from desperation. It was a weapon of pure innovation. At only 80 feet long and 20 feet wide, it was smaller than most private yachts. Made from laminated mahogany plywood instead of steel, it looked like it could barely survive a run-in with a stiff breeze, let alone a battle. But beneath its delicate exterior lay something powerful. Powered by 3 Packard 51-12 engines, modified from aircraft technology, the PT boat could reach speeds over 45 knots, faster than any destroyer or torpedo ship. This speed would be our greatest asset. We carried 4 21-inch torpedo tubes, each armed with a Mark 13 torpedo, a 20mm cannon, and several 0.5 caliber machine guns. We were lightly armored with only the bare minimum of protection. The living quarters were cramped, hot bunking was common, and you had to sleep in shifts just to make room for everyone. The boats weren't made for comfort, and they certainly weren't made for safety. A direct hit from anything larger than a rifle bullet could turn us into a pile of kindling floating on the water, but none of that mattered. What mattered was the mission. Every PT boat was a gamble. The men aboard knew the risks. Our mission was to strike fast and hard, take down the enemy, and get out before the Japanese even knew what happened. It was a game of cat and mouse, but we were the ones playing the role of the cat. I remember the first time I saw a PT boat. It was February 1943, at the Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron's Training Center in Melville, Rhode Island. I'd just come off convoy duty in the North Atlantic, where I'd seen enough of war to last a lifetime. I was a destroyer sailor, used to big ships with big guns, so when the Navy asked for volunteers to work on these experimental vessels, I didn't quite know what to expect. But they didn't tell us much, except that the casualty rate was expected to be high, over 50%. Out of 200 volunteers, they selected only 40. I made the cut because I could navigate by the stars and had experience with small boats from my days back on Chesapeake Bay. The first time I stepped aboard PT-164, I thought the Navy had lost its mind. This wasn't a warship. It was a glorified speedboat with dreams of grandeur. The hull was wood, not steel. The living space was so cramped that it felt like we were all packed into a tin can. There was no armor to speak of, just a thin sheet of metal around the bridge to keep us from being immediately wiped out by enemy fire. It was nothing like the cruisers I'd known, with their gleaming steel and towering masts. But when Mac McPhersonson, our skipper, took charge, everything changed. Mac was 28 years old, which made him ancient by PT boat standards. His eyes were weathered, his face lined with the kind of experience only war could bring. He'd been stationed at Pearl Harbor during the attack, survived Midway, and volunteered for PT boats because, as he put it, "I'm tired of being a target. Time to become the hunter." He was right. The PT boat wasn't meant to fight like a conventional warship. We weren't built for traditional naval tactics. Instead, we were designed to be nimble, stealthy, and quick. We struck when the enemy least expected it, and we were gone before they could retaliate. We were the pirates of the Pacific, the Navy's secret weapon. The crew of PT-164 was a mismatched group of specialists, each of us bringing something unique to the table. Dutch Vanderberg, our executive officer, was a Yale mathematician who could calculate torpedo firing solutions faster than most men could use a slide rule. Carlos Charlie Mendoza, our chief motor machinist mate, had been building racing engines before the war, and he treated the Packards with the same precision he applied to his race cars. William Sparks Patterson, our radio man, came from the submarine service, where he had learned how to operate radios in complete silence. And Patrick "Paddy" O'Brien, our torpedo man, had an almost fanatical dedication to the Mark 13 torpedoes. He treated those torpedoes like they were his children, making sure each one was perfect before firing it. Each of us knew the risks, but we also knew the mission, to strike from the shadows and make every moment count. We were ready because we had no choice. The Japanese had dominated the night for too long. It was time to take it back. April 1943. Training wasn't just about learning tactics, it was about surviving. The Navy had thrown us into the deep end, and we had to swim or sink. The world we were about to step into wasn't like anything any of us had experienced before. It was raw, relentless, and unforgiving. The Solomon Islands weren't a place for conventional warships, and they sure as hell weren't a place for the unprepared. We were a ragtag crew misfits, really gathered from all walks of life. Some of us had never even seen the ocean before, let alone fought in one. We were sailors, yes, but not like any sailors the Navy had seen. Most of us came from small towns, others from cities, but we all had one thing in common. We'd volunteered, and once we'd stepped aboard our PT boats, there was no turning back. Training at Melville was brutal, and I'm not sure any of us were fully ready for it. The Navy had learned the hard way that enthusiasm alone wasn't enough. We had to be fast, smarter, and tougher than anything the Japanese could throw at us. We practiced high-speed maneuvers until our bodies ached from the constant pounding. Our boats bounced across the waves at 40 knots, and our goal was simple: hit the enemy hard and fast, then get out before they could retaliate. We learned to fight in conditions no one else could. When tropical squalls rolled in and visibility dropped to zero, we learned to navigate by sound and instinct. We learned how to use the radar shadows cast by the islands to hide our approach. It was a new kind of warfare, one where traditional naval tactics didn't apply. And we learned to think like pirates. Commander James "Wild Jim" Patterson ran our training program, and he was exactly the kind of man we needed. He had survived the campaign in the Philippines and had narrowly escaped Corregidor on one of the last PT boats out. His philosophy was simple, and it wasn't like anything we'd heard from our traditional Navy officers. "The Japanese expect you to fight fair," he said, pacing in front of us one day. "Don't, they expect you to follow their traditions, to fight like battleships in open water. Don't, they expect you to be afraid of the dark. Make them afraid instead." And that's exactly what we did. We became shadows, ghosts on the water. We learned to strike from ambush, to use the cover of night, and to make our enemies fear us. The Japanese Navy thought they controlled the dark. Well, we would prove them wrong. Our greatest weapons weren't our torpedoes or guns. It was surprise, speed, and audacity. That was the core of the PT boat's power. As our training intensified, we became a family, bound together by a shared mission and the knowledge that none of us would survive this without the others. The crew of PT-164 was something of a miracle, a group of specialists who should never have been in the same unit, yet somehow managed to make it work. Dutch Vanderberg, our executive officer, was a Yale mathematics professor. He wasn't the type you'd expect to see in command of a small boat, but his ability to calculate torpedo firing solutions in his head faster than most men could use a slide rule made him invaluable. He could look at the enemy's formation, chart the currents, wind speed, and moon position, and then plot the perfect attack with eerie precision. Charlie Mendoza, our chief motor machinist mate, had been building racing engines in Los Angeles before the war. His ability to keep our temperamental Packard engines running at peak performance was nothing short of magic. He could make them hum like a fine-tuned sports car, or roar like lions when we needed speed. William Sparks Patterson, our radio man, came from the submarine service. He had learned to operate radios in complete silence, and that was a skill he brought to PT-164. In the silence of the night, our communications had to be flawless, and Sparks was the best. Then there was Patrick "Paddy" O'Brien, our torpedo man. He was an artist when it came to the Mark 13 torpedoes. They were our weapons of choice, and each one had to be perfect. He treated those torpedoes like they were his children, adjusting them with the care and precision only a true professional could manage. We weren't just a crew, we were a team, a group of specialists who'd never have served together on a conventional Navy vessel. We came from different backgrounds, different places, but we all had one thing in common: we had volunteered. We knew the odds, but we also knew that this was the only way forward. If we were going to survive this war, we had to stick together. By the time we finished training, we were no longer just sailors. We had become warriors. We were no longer just a collection of individuals. We were a crew, united by purpose. and we had one goal: to strike fear into the hearts of the Japanese Navy. We were about to be thrust into the heart of battle. The waters of the Solomon Islands were our battleground, and the Japanese didn't know it yet, but we were coming for them. June 30, 1943. We were stationed at Renova, a base so small it barely seemed real. There was no grand fortress here, no shining docks or towering structures. It was nothing more than a few Quonset huts hidden under palm fronds, a rough dock, and the constant smell of diesel fuel and decaying vegetation. The air was thick with the stench of rot, a reminder that the tropical islands of the Pacific were not a place for comfort. The first thing that struck me when we arrived wasn't the heat, though that was oppressive enough. It was the sound, the distant rumble of artillery from New Georgia, where Marines were fighting and dying to capture Munda Airfield. That was the backdrop for our mission, fighting in the shadows while the men on the ground bled in the sun. Our job was simple in theory: patrol the waters between the Japanese strongholds and sink anything flying the rising sun. But in practice, it was far from that easy. The Japanese had an almost supernatural ability to track us. They used coast watchers on every major island, their eyes constantly searching for our boats. Their destroyers were trained to hunt us, and their reconnaissance planes watched the skies above us, never giving us a moment's peace. We didn't have the luxury of facing a clear enemy or fighting from a safe distance. The waters we patrolled were a deadly maze of coral reefs, volcanic islands, and hidden Japanese strongpoints, and the Japanese were never alone. Their convoys came with heavy escorts, destroyers, and trained soldiers, all of whom knew exactly how to fight in these waters. Our first patrol was an absolute disaster. It was July 5th, just days after we had settled in at Renova. The mission seemed straightforward: intercept a Japanese convoy near Visu, but the reality was far worse. We were spotted by an enemy float plane long before we could even close in for an attack. Within minutes, 4 enemy destroyers were charging at us, searchlights blazing, guns firing. The enemy had us cornered, and we scattered like rabbits, trying to find any way to escape. The shells were too close. The water around us turned into a storm of explosions, with shrapnel flying in every direction. PT-158, one of our sister boats, took a direct hit from a 5-inch shell. It was gone in an instant, 12 men dead, their boat disintegrated. We spent 4 hours dodging through reefs and islands, praying for a miracle. No torpedoes were fired, no enemy ships were sunk. But we had lost a boat, and we had learned a painful lesson. We could not fight the Japanese like conventional warships. We couldn't afford to engage in a gunfight. We had to strike from ambush, and if we couldn't do that, then we shouldn't engage at all. That night, as we sat in the darkness of our base, licking our wounds, Mac gathered us together. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His eyes told us everything we needed to know. "We learned something important today," he said quietly, almost to himself. "We can't fight them like destroyers fight each other. We're not built for gun duels. We strike from ambush, or we don't strike at all." It was a hard lesson, paid for with blood, but it shaped every mission that followed. We couldn't afford to make mistakes. If we were going to survive, we had to be faster, smarter, and more ruthless than the enemy. Over the next 2 weeks, we refined our tactics through trial and error. We learned to use the island's radar shadows to hide our approach. We discovered that shutting down 2 of our 3 engines reduced our noise signature dramatically. And most importantly, we learned how to coordinate attacks using simple light signals that the Japanese couldn't intercept. The intelligence network supporting us was nothing short of incredible. Australian coast watchers, hidden in the hills of Japanese-occupied islands, would radio us with enemy ship movements. Native Solomon Islanders, risking death to help us, would paddle their canoes out to meet us with critical information about Japanese positions. Occasionally, we'd even receive decrypted intelligence from Pearl Harbor, giving us exact convoy schedules. But most of the time, we had to rely on instinct. We had to trust each other, because in those waters, we were on our own. Despite our best efforts to remain in the shadows, we were still largely a secret. Official Navy communications referred to us as small craft or mosquito boats. The Japanese didn't know our real name, they didn't know who we were, but they were starting to realize something was hitting their convoys. Initial reports described us as submarines or mines, unable to believe that we could be small wooden boats attacking their steel warships. It was a mistake they wouldn't make again. But for now, we remained hidden. It was the night of July 18th, just days after the failed patrol, that we received our first real break. Our intelligence network had confirmed that a major Japanese convoy was on its way through Blackett Strait, heading to reinforce the garrison at VA on Kolombangara. This was our chance: 3 large transports with minimal escort. The timing was perfect. The enemy was heading straight into our kill zone, and we would be waiting. Mac gathered us for the briefing. There was no bravado, no speechifying, just the facts. "This is it," he said, voice steady but serious. "This convoy cannot reach VA. I don't care if you have to ram those transports. They go to the bottom tonight." The orders were clear: no retreat, no hesitation. This mission was everything. July 19, 1943. The sun had long since set, casting the sky in shades of red and orange, but the beauty of the evening did nothing to calm the storm brewing in our chests. As we prepared for the attack, everything seemed to slow down, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for the chaos to begin. The Japanese convoy was just a few miles away, and we were positioned perfectly, hidden in the shadow of Villa Le Vella's volcanic cliffs. Mac's voice came over the radio, low and steady. "Get ready, gentlemen, this is it." We were ready. We had trained for this moment. Every drill, every mission, every narrow escape had brought us here, but nothing could truly prepare us for what we were about to face. There was no turning back now. PT-164, PT-168, and PT-171 were in position, engines cut to a near-silent hum. The night around us was thick with anticipation, the water barely a ripple as we waited for the right moment to strike. The convoy, unaware of the storm approaching, continued its course. Their destroyers were in the lead, and behind them the transports. Each one was carrying soldiers, supplies, and the threat of more bloodshed for our forces on the ground. For us, tonight wasn't just about sinking ships. It was about stopping the Japanese war machine in its tracks. The plan was simple. We would strike in a three-pronged attack. PT-168 would hit from the port side, PT-171 would come in from the starboard, and PT-164, our boat, would go straight down the middle, aiming for the lead transport. It was a dangerous plan, moving between the two escorting destroyers at close range, threading the needle of fire and steel, but it was the only chance we had. If we could create enough confusion, we would have the upper hand. I glanced at Dutch, who was scanning the horizon through his binoculars. His face was set in a grim expression. "They're coming," he whispered. We were all thinking the same thing. The moment we'd trained for had arrived. The boats were steady beneath us, engines ready to roar, torpedoes primed and waiting. "Stay calm," Mac's voice crackled through the radio. "We're gonna hit them hard. One shot, one kill, then we vanish." At 23:47, we saw them, dark shapes against the backdrop of the stars. The Japanese convoy was right where it should be. 2 destroyers in front, 3 transports following. It was like a scene out of a nightmare, steel giants cruising through the night, completely unaware of the storm they were about to face. Mac's voice came over the radio again, "All ahead slow." Our engines hummed to life, barely making a sound as we crept forward. The water was calm, making us easier to spot, but also hiding us in its depths. Every second felt like an eternity as we closed in on our target. We had to wait for the perfect moment. We couldn't rush this. As we neared, the Japanese ships continued their steady course, oblivious to the danger lurking just out of sight. The gap between us and the convoy was shrinking. We could hear the low rumble of their engines, a deep thrum that seemed to shake the water beneath us. At 2,000 yards, Dutch spotted them clearly through his binoculars. "We've got them," he said, his voice steady despite the tension. "They're still in formation. Perfect." Mac gave the order, "Prepare to attack." At exactly 00:18, the moment we had been waiting for arrived. Dutch signaled with 3 sharp clicks on the radio, and we surged forward, engines roaring to life. The boats leaped out of the water, cutting through the night at full speed, headed straight for the heart of the convoy. The night shattered as we raced toward them, the sound of our engines deafening in the otherwise silent sea. It felt like we were flying, the water beneath us a blur. In those brief moments, the world around us seemed to disappear. We were focused entirely on the mission, on the task at hand. The Japanese were caught completely off guard. They had trained for submarines, for destroyers, never for fast-moving boats like ours, closing in with the speed and fury of a storm. Their lookouts, trained to spot the slow-moving shadows of submarines, never saw us coming. We were inside their formation before they even realized what was happening. The lead destroyer was less than 1,000 yards away, and we were on it, racing between the destroyers, closing in on the transport. I opened fire with my twin 0.5 caliber machine guns, the deafening rattle of gunfire filling the night. The tracers streaked through the air, punching holes in the bridge of the lead destroyer. The enemy guns began to return fire, but they were too slow. We were already past them, moving at a blistering speed, and they couldn't adjust in time. We were a blur of wood and steel, vanishing into the night before they could even react. "Fire one," shouted Paddy, launching our first torpedo. The mechanical fish leapt from its tube, splashing into the water with a hiss before disappearing into the dark. A second later, our second torpedo followed suit. The wake from both torpedoes left a trail of phosphorescent bubbles behind them as they sped toward their target. It was close, too close to miss. The first torpedo hit with a thunderous explosion that lit up the night like lightning. The transport rocked violently, the explosion tearing through its hull, sending shockwaves through the water. The second torpedo hit midship, and with a sickening crack, the ship split in half, both sections sinking into the Black Sea. The chaos was overwhelming. The Japanese had no idea how to respond. Their searchlights flicked on, blinding in their intensity, but it was too late. The damage was done. We didn't stop. We pressed on, racing toward the second transport, but the Japanese destroyers weren't giving up. They tried to ram us, their massive bows slicing through the water, aiming to crush us beneath their weight. Mac threw the wheel hard right, the boat pivoting like a dancer, narrowly missing the destroyer's bow. As we passed, I emptied a full belt of ammunition into their bridge, watching sparks fly as my bullets found their mark. As we turned for another pass, the enemy responded with everything they had. Shells whizzed by, explosions rocked the sea around us, but we had already dealt our blow, and now we were slipping back into the darkness. July 19, 1943. The night erupted into chaos. Our boat sliced through the darkness, a blur of speed and destruction. We had done what we came to do, hit hard, hit fast, and leave the enemy in ruins. But the battle was far from over. The Japanese destroyers were now fully aware of our presence, and the convoy, thrown into disarray, was scrambling to respond. The air was thick with the sound of gunfire, the low rumble of enemy destroyers, and the incessant whine of our engines as we raced through the water. We had just made our first pass, sinking the lead transport and crippling the second, but the Japanese weren't finished yet. Their guns were now trained on us, their searchlights sweeping the water, trying to spot us in the vast darkness. The sea was alive with danger. I could hear the shells whizzing past, the sharp whistle of near misses as the water around us was torn apart by exploding shrapnel. I ducked instinctively, my heart racing. Every second felt like a lifetime. We were too close to stop now. We had to finish what we started. Fire one, Paddy's voice cut through the chaos, his calm demeanor belying the tension in the air. He had already fired our first 2 torpedoes, but there was no time to waste. The second transport was still moving, albeit slower, and we had one more shot to take it down. I watched as the torpedo tubes opened, the mechanical fish ready to fly. There was no time to hesitate. We had only one chance. Fire, I shouted, my fingers tightening on the triggers. The torpedoes leapt from their tubes, leaving twin wakes of phosphorescent bubbles in their wake. The world seemed to hold its breath as the torpedoes sped toward their target. The first hit dead center, the second struck amidships, and the explosion was deafening. The ship lifted partially out of the water, and in that instant, everything seemed to slow down. Then, with a sickening crack, the vessel split in two, its massive bulk sinking into the dark sea. The water around us was alive with the aftermath of the blast, flaming debris falling from the sky, smoke billowing across the water, and the faint, distant screams of soldiers as they were thrown into the sea. It was a sight I'll never forget. But we didn't have time to dwell on the success. The Japanese were responding now, and they weren't going down without a fight. Their destroyers turned hard, trying to ram us with their massive bows, their guns now locked onto our boats. The odds were against us, but we couldn't stop. Mac threw the wheel hard to the right, just narrowly avoiding a collision with one of the destroyers. The ship's bow came within feet of us, the immense weight of the enemy ship bearing down on our tiny wooden hull. It was a move that could have crushed us in an instant, but Mac was a master at the helm. He pivoted the boat like a dancer, sending us careening out of the path of the destroyer, missing it by a hair. As we passed, I opened fire with the twin 0.5 caliber guns, my rounds slamming into the bridge of the destroyer at point-blank range. Sparks flew as my bullets struck home, and I could see the enemy crew scrambling in panic, trying to return fire. But it was too late. We had already moved past them, our boat now surging into the darkness, leaving them in our wake. The battle was far from over. PT-171, our sister boat, was still engaged with the third transport. Joey Antonelli, their skipper, had lined up the perfect shot, but the Japanese destroyers were more prepared now. They had turned their searchlights on him, blinding him with their intensity. The sound of gunfire filled the air as PT-171 took hits from the destroyers. One of the shells slammed into their bow, but by some miracle, it didn't detonate. The warhead on the torpedo needed to spin in the water before it would arm itself, and this one hadn't had the chance. Despite the damage, Joey didn't hesitate. He knew the mission was too important to turn back, but with one of their engines out, and with smoke trailing from their boat, they were forced to abort their attack. They had no choice but to retreat, weaving between the shell splashes as they fled toward the safety of the darkness. We couldn't afford to wait. The element of surprise was fading fast, and the Japanese were now fully aware of our presence. Every searchlight in the convoy was on us. Their guns were firing in every direction, and the water around us looked like a storm torn apart by shell splashes, but we had one last shot. "Launch remaining fish and get us out of here," Mac shouted over the din of the battle, his voice as calm as ever despite the chaos. We had one last torpedo to fire, and we had to make it count. Paddy launched the last two Mark 13 torpedoes, but the Japanese ships were already reacting. The remaining transport captain saw the torpedoes coming and managed to maneuver just in time, avoiding the blasts. The torpedoes splashed harmlessly along his sides. It was over for now. We were battered, but we were still alive. Our engines roared to life as we turned away from the scene of devastation. The battle behind us was still raging, but we had done what we came to do. The convoy had been shattered. Two of the transports were at the bottom of the sea, taking over 6,000 Japanese soldiers with them. We regrouped 5 miles south of the engagement zone, our boats battered but still afloat. PT-171 had taken the worst of it, with holes in her hull and one engine out, but we couldn't afford to stop. We came alongside them, helping transfer the wounded and patching up the damage as best we could. PT-168 had taken some hits too, but she remained combat-ready. PT-164, our boat, had somehow escaped with only minor damage, a few shrapnel holes, a burned-out gun barrel, and scorch marks from near misses. We had done our job. We had struck from the shadows, and now the darkness was ours. July 20, 1943. The night was over, but the war wasn't. We had done what we set out to do. We had struck the Japanese convoy, sunk 2 transports, and disrupted their reinforcements. But as we limped back to base, battered and bruised, it was clear the price of victory had been steep. The sea was calmer now, almost eerily so. The chaos of the battle had faded, but the toll it had taken on us was still fresh. We weren't the same crew that had set out hours ago. Each of us was carrying the weight of what had happened, even if no one spoke about it directly. The boat creaked beneath me, its wood scarred from the battle, but it was still floating, and that was more than we could say for the enemy. We had won, but the cost was hard to ignore. PT-171 was in the worst shape, with multiple holes in her hull and one engine completely out of commission. The crew had done what they could to plug the leaks, but there was no denying the boat was in rough shape, but at least they were still afloat. That was more than we could say for PT-158, which had been blown to pieces hours earlier. 12 men had been lost in an instant, their boat disintegrated by a direct hit from a 5-inch shell. The thought of them, those men who had been with us only hours before, hit hard. There was no time to mourn, not yet, but the weight of that loss hung over us. We made our way back to Renova, a journey that should have taken only 3 hours, but the reality of our situation made it feel like an eternity. Every minute felt like a small eternity as we threaded our way through the maze of islands, staying hidden from the enemy's prying eyes. We were only a few miles out when we saw the Japanese float planes beginning their search, scouring the waters for any sign of us. We had to stay hidden, blending into the islands, as if we were just another shadow in the night. The irony wasn't lost on me. We had spent so much time hunting the Japanese in the dark, and now we were doing the same, hiding from them. Every minute we spent out there, waiting for the enemy to pass, felt like we were playing a dangerous game of cat and mouse, but that was the nature of this war. It wasn't just about sinking ships or taking ground. It was about survival, about staying one step ahead. By the time we reached Renova, the sun was beginning to rise, casting a pale light over the horizon. The journey had taken us 14 hours, a trip that should have been no more than 3, but we made it back bruised but alive, and that's what mattered. The debriefing was exhaustive. We had to recount every detail of the mission, the enemy's movements, the weapons they used, the tactics they employed. The intelligence officers were hungry for information, and we gave them what we could. Every scrap of information was precious. The lessons learned from our mission would be distributed to every PT squadron in the Pacific, giving them the tools to fight more effectively, to outthink the enemy, and to survive. But the immediate impact was even greater. We had disrupted the Japanese reinforcement schedule. We had prevented thousands of soldiers from reaching their destination, from reinforcing the garrison at VA on Kolombangara. 2 transports were gone, and nearly 6,000 soldiers had been lost. That was a blow the Japanese couldn't easily recover from. Still, the toll on us was hard to ignore. The cost of this success was measured in the lives of our fellow sailors. PT-158 was gone, and PT-171 would need significant repairs before she could go back into battle. But we had done what we set out to do. We had stopped the Japanese reinforcements, and that, for the moment, was enough. As we sat in the debriefing room, waiting for the orders that would come next, my mind kept returning to the faces of the men we'd lost. They hadn't asked for this, but they had volunteered anyway, just like we had. We were all in this together, and we had all known the risks. But that didn't make it any easier. Losing good men, good sailors, was never easy, no matter how necessary the mission had been. We didn't have time to mourn, not yet. The war wasn't over, and there were still more battles to fight. But as I looked around at the men who had survived the mission, I knew one thing for sure. We were a different kind of crew now. We had been tested in ways we couldn't have imagined, and we had passed that test, together. The Japanese didn't know it yet, but the tide was turning. They had been caught off guard, and they would pay for it. But we couldn't afford to celebrate. There was more work to be done. The Pacific was vast, and the Japanese Navy was still out there. Our mission wasn't finished, not by a long shot. July 1943. The days that followed were filled with mixed emotions. On the surface, it was a time to regroup and recover, but deep down, each of us knew the impact of what we had done. The battle had been fierce, but it was only the beginning of a new kind of warfare in the Pacific. The Japanese Navy had been shaken, but they weren't broken yet. They would adapt, and we would have to stay ahead of them. That's how it was going to be from now on. A battle of shadows, a fight that demanded constant innovation. The legacy of what we had accomplished on that night would echo throughout the Pacific. Our success hadn't been about firepower or technology. It had been about the way we fought, stealth, speed, and audacity. The PT boats weren't just small craft that fired torpedoes and made fast escapes. We were an entirely new concept in naval warfare. The Japanese, used to dominating the seas at night, now had to contend with a new, unpredictable enemy. We had made them doubt the very darkness they once ruled. The psychological impact was enormous. The Japanese had relied on their established strategies, superior night fighting, larger fleets, and overwhelming numbers, but the PT boats were proving that size and power weren't everything. What mattered was surprise, precision, and speed, and we, with our small wooden boats, had shown them that we could be just as deadly, if not more so, than their heavy warships. Our actions in the Solomons did more than just disrupt the Japanese supply chain. It shattered their sense of invincibility. For months, the Japanese Navy had ruled the night, moving with impunity under the cover of darkness. But now, every time a Japanese convoy set out under the moon, they couldn't be sure if there was a PT boat lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to strike. The fear of the unknown, of being attacked by fast, agile boats that appeared from nowhere, turned the night into an unpredictable battleground. The Japanese response was immediate. They started changing their tactics. Convoys grew larger but less frequent. They sent out more destroyer escorts and even started using reconnaissance planes equipped with searchlights to scan the waters. Their movements became slower, more cautious, and far more predictable. The PT boats had thrown the Japanese Navy off balance, and that was a victory in itself. The psychological blow was perhaps even more significant than the tactical one. When the Japanese soldiers, waiting for reinforcements, learned that the ships they were counting on were at the bottom of the sea, morale began to crumble. This wasn't just about losing ships. It was about losing the certainty they had relied on, the certainty that they could move supplies and soldiers freely, whenever and wherever they pleased. But the PT boats didn't just change the way the Japanese moved through the night, they changed the way the world viewed naval warfare. The concept of small, fast, and deadly boats wasn't new. The British had experimented with similar designs. But it was the American innovation, the willingness to take risks and defy conventional wisdom, that turned the PT boat into something more. We had proved that courage and ingenuity could overcome size and strength. The legacy of the PT boats would live on, not just in the Pacific, but in naval warfare as a whole. In the weeks following the attack, the PT boat program expanded rapidly. More boats were built, more crews trained, and more bases set up across the Pacific. Each new squadron that joined us in the fight was a testament to the success of our strategy. The boats were improved, better engines, better radar, and more armor. Yet they still carried the same essence that had made the first PT boats so revolutionary: speed, surprise, and audacity. As the war progressed, PT boats would continue to play a key role in every major operation. From the Philippines to the Mediterranean, from the English Channel to the rivers of Europe, the lessons we had learned in the Solomon Islands were applied to new theaters of war. The PT boats would become a symbol of American resilience and adaptability, proving that even the smallest force could have a massive impact on the outcome of a war. But the price of success was always there, hovering in the background. We knew the risks. We knew we were part of something new, something that could change the course of history, but it came at a cost. We had lost men. We had lost boats, and in the months that followed, we would lose more. I can still remember the faces of those who didn't make it back, the men from PT-158, the crew of PT-171. I can still see their faces in my mind, even though they were lost to the sea. Their sacrifices weren't in vain. They had proven that the PT boats could make a difference. They had shown the world that small boats, made of wood and powered by nothing more than human courage and innovation, could take down a steel giant. We would carry that legacy forward. 1944. The war was far from over, but the course of the Pacific had already been changed. The legacy of the PT boats wasn't something that could be measured in just torpedoes fired or ships sunk. It was in the disruption we caused, the fear we instilled, and the lessons we passed down to the generations of sailors who would follow. But for those of us who served on the PT boats, the impact was far more personal. We were a part of something larger than ourselves, something that would shape the future of naval warfare, but it was also something that would forever change each of us. By the time I returned to the Pacific in 1944 as the executive officer of PT-321, the boats had changed. They were faster, better equipped, and more reliable. The radar was improved, the armor had been upgraded, and the torpedoes were more accurate. But the heart of the PT boat still remained the same. It was still about speed, surprise, and audacity, and those principles would continue to guide us as we took on the Japanese Navy once again. The tactics that had been developed in the Solomons were now standard doctrine for every PT squadron in the Pacific, but with that standardization came a sense of pride, because we knew we had been part of something revolutionary. We had proven that even small, fast boats could change the outcome of a war. We had shown the world that ingenuity and determination could overcome the most entrenched traditions. One story that always stands out to me is from October 1944 during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. A squadron of PT boats, outgunned and outnumbered, attacked the Japanese battleship Yamato, the largest warship ever built. We knew our torpedoes wouldn't penetrate the battleship's thick armor, but we attacked anyway. The Yamato turned to avoid us, buying precious time for the American carriers to escape. We didn't sink the giant that day, but our courage saved lives. And that was what the PT boats were all about, doing what needed to be done, even when the odds were against us. Our bases, too, became legends, places like Renova, Chalagi, and Mios. They weren't like Pearl Harbor or San Diego, where officers lived in comfort and safety. Our bases were muddy hellholes, filled with mosquitoes, malaria, and a constant sense of danger. Yet in those conditions, we found a sense of camaraderie that would bond us for life. We lived on Spam and cigarettes, waiting for mail that never came. The only entertainment was poker and rumors, but somehow our morale remained high. We knew we were making a difference, and that was enough. The natives of the Solomon Islands were crucial to our success. Without their help, we would have been blind in the dark, unable to track the enemy's movements. They risked their lives to provide us with intelligence, guiding us through reefs, rescuing downed airmen, and bringing us vital information. Many of them paid with their lives when caught helping us, yet they never hesitated. Their bravery was as vital to our success as any torpedo or gunfire. The Coast Watchers, those unsung heroes hiding on Japanese-occupied islands, were our eyes and ears. They would radio us with enemy ship movements, saving us from surprise attacks and helping us position for the perfect ambush. We never met most of them, but we owed them our lives. Their sacrifice and dedication made our missions possible. Even with all the improvements, the PT boats remained crude by modern standards. We spent as much time maintaining our boats as we did fighting in them. The saltwater corroded everything. The heat rotted wood and fabric. High-speed operations tested every part of the boat to its limit. We became mechanics, carpenters, and electricians by necessity. A PT boat with engine failure in enemy waters was a death sentence, so we treated maintenance like a religion. We also learned to live with the dangers of the Solomons. Tropical squalls could appear from nowhere, turning calm seas into walls of water. Lightning could fry our radios, and the heat could make us pass out at the helm. But the bad weather was as much our friend as our enemy. It hid us from enemy aircraft and made our boats harder to spot. Looking back, I'm amazed we survived. We were kids, really just young men thrown into a war that killed millions. We made mistakes that should have killed us, took risks that make me shudder in retrospect. But we also accomplished something remarkable. We proved that small, fast boats could change the course of a war. We showed the world that American sailors, many of whom had never seen the ocean before Pearl Harbor, could defeat the best navy in the world at their own game. By the time I was rotated back to the States for new construction training, the PT boat program had grown exponentially. New boats were built, better equipped, and ready for the next wave of battle. But the lessons we had learned in the Solomons in the heart of that brutal war would live on. We had proven that courage mattered more than size, that innovation could overcome tradition, and that even the smallest force could have a massive impact. When I think of the legacy of the PT boats, it's not just about the ships we sank or the battles we won. It's about the proof that free people, fighting for their freedom, could overcome any tyranny. The Japanese, who had studied us for years, never saw us coming. We were small, fast, and deadly. We were the mosquito fleet that brought down an empire, one torpedo at a time. As I sit here now, years after the war, I can still hear those Packard engines roaring in the night, still feel the spray of Solomon sea water on my face, and still smell the cordite and diesel fumes. Most of all, I remember the pride of being part of something that changed naval warfare forever. We didn't just fight the Japanese, we changed how wars would be fought from that day on.